Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Paul Bartlett and I'm a correspondent for Seatrade Maritime News. Today, in this regulatory broadcast, I'm going to talk about 3 upcoming emission regulations that will affect ship owners in Europe and those trading to and from the region. As everyone knows, regulations are tightening and they have significant implications for many shipping companies. Ship owners and operators trading in Europe or on voyages to or from the continent may well have become accustomed by now to managing the requirements of the European Union emissions trading system. They will have been monitoring, reporting and verifying their ships' emissions since January in preparation for submitting EU allowances covering those emissions by the end of September 2025. Introduced in 2005 to tackle emissions from carbon-intensive sectors, including power, steel, cement, and agriculture, the world's first international emissions trading regulations were extended to include shipping from January the 1st this year. But if ship owners and operators believe this year has been a headache, they have another shock in store. 2025 is likely to prove much more challenging. Not only do emissions trading system regulations tighten significantly, but there are also 2 entirely new separate regulations entering force during the year. Fuel EU Maritime comes into effect on January the 1st, and for many owners trading in and out of the European Economic Area, which is the European Union plus Iceland, Liechtenstein and Norway, but not the United Kingdom, it is requiring a root and branch overhaul of bunkering strategies. Then, at the beginning of May, the entire Mediterranean Sea will become an emissions control area. New sulfur reduction regulations will apply to ships trading regionally, as well as the large number of ocean-going vessels crossing the sea in both directions between Asia, Europe, and ports on the US East Coast. Many large shipping companies, notably container lines operating on the Asia-Europe trades, have already adopted proactive strategies to handle emissions trading system compliance, with teams of people in place working out the best ways of managing these growing regulatory challenges. From January, they will also be addressing the more complex requirements of Fuel EU Maritime and from May, the Mediterranean Emissions Control Area. However, there are also hundreds of smaller owners and operators in which responsibility for fuel management strategy lies with operations personnel who frequently have more than enough to do already. For shipping companies whose vessels operate in the Mediterranean, scope to procure sufficient volumes of low-sulfur bunker fuel will be another headache. The regulations are also particularly challenging for tramp operators whose ships trade worldwide and may only call at ports within the European Economic Area from time to time. Accounting for even a single voyage into European waters is already required under the emissions trading system and will also be necessary under the Fuel EU regulation from January. Here we will outline some of the key aspects of new fuel regulations and highlight the fact that a wait-and-see approach is definitely not a sound strategy. Steps should already have been taken to ensure compliance and potentially even to make some of the regulations work with positive outcomes.
If you're enjoying the Seatrade Maritime podcast, make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing on the app of your choice.
So let's start with Fuel EU Maritime. Applicable to the same vessels as the emissions trading system, cargo ships and passenger vessels of 5,000 gross tons and above, this measure is aimed at speeding the take-up of more sustainable bunker fuels. It will enter force in January and comes on top of the emissions trading system which has been running since the beginning of this year. In just a month's time, Fuel EU will fundamentally change the shipping industry's long-standing bunkering arrangements, with penalties for using some fuels, but potential gains for using others. Perhaps surprisingly, the regulation provides an indication of the fuels most likely to be favoured in the future, fundamentally different and significantly more complex than the emissions trading system. It is based on a carrot and stick approach to fuel decarbonisation between now and mid-century. Under ETS rules, owners with ships trading in, to or from Europe buy EU allowances covering the carbon emitted from the fuel they use and submit the allowances as a form of carbon tax. Fuel EU, however, is based on a different setup. Perhaps unfortunately, it uses a little-known metric to measure the carbon intensity of fuels: grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule of energy. And critically, it gauges fuel performance on a well-to-wake basis, splitting the supply and production process in well-to-tank analysis, as well as shipboard fuel performance in the tank-to-wake process. The key number for carbon intensity during the first 5 years of Fuel EU operation is 89.3 grams of carbon dioxide equivalent per megajoule. 89.3. If a ship uses fuel that falls under this magic number, it will comply with the regulation and generate a compliance surplus. If, on the other hand, a ship burns fuel that emits more than 89.3, it will generate a compliance deficit. The benchmark will fall every 5 years between now and mid-century, from an initial 89.3 in 2025 to 85.7 in 2030, 77.9 in 2035, 62.9 in 2040, 34.4 in 2045, and 18.2 in 2050. And it is important to note that not one of the future fuels currently under development for main propulsion systems will meet the mid-century target of 18.2. The fact that the Fuel EU formula is based on a well-to-wake basis has a significant impact on the emissions profile of marine fuels. It is also a complex formula with various discounts applied relating to variables such as ice class operation, wind propulsion, shore power, and the use of renewable fuels of non-biological origin, also known as synthetic fuels or e-fuels. Experts say that this approach has been developed so that Fuel EU takes account of real-life ship operation. However, it is also designed to encourage the take-up of more sustainable fuels and to encourage ship owners to fine-tune their bunkering strategies to achieve optimal compliance performance. Fuel EU, they say, has been designed to encourage owners to adopt fuels that could effectively reduce overall bunkering costs by generating compliance surpluses. However, over time, as the carbon intensity number falls, this will become increasingly difficult. For now, though, the Fuel EU setup will encourage smart bunkering strategies that have the potential to generate new income streams and offset the dramatically higher costs of the marine fuels of tomorrow. It is, therefore, a regulation that warrants close attention. According to analysis carried out by Hamburg-based Ocean Score, a consultancy specializing in ship emissions compliance, very low sulfur fuel oil, marine gas oil, and LNG used in a medium-speed Otto cycle engine will all generate compliance deficits from the outset. Traditional fossil methanol, ammonia, and hydrogen all fare badly when measured on a well-to-wake basis, Ocean Score has revealed, because their production is carbon intensive. Meanwhile, even accounting for methane slip, LNG used as fuel in a slow-speed Otto cycle diesel engine falls below the 89.3 tipping point and generates compliance surpluses. This may come as a surprise to many, but is explained by the fact that the production of LNG, accounted for on a well-to-tank basis, is much cleaner than other fuels. LPG and ethane also perform well. As an aside, the fact that LNG is significantly more sustainable than methanol and already has a functioning supply chain could be a factor influencing the latest round of container ship contracts. At the end of October, for example, news broke that both Maersk and Hapag-Lloyd had ordered 28 large vessels based on dual-fuel LNG designs. Further into the future, renewable fuels of non-biological origin, e-fuels, are likely to offer the best option, according to analysis. Biofuels from food and feed crops are not acceptable under the Fuel EU regulation, preventing the use of palm oil-based fuels and biodiesel from rapeseed, soybeans or sunflowers. Biodiesel from animal fat or waste cooking oil, however, are allowed and are particularly attractive, with emission scores of 22.3 and 16.4 respectively. Use of these fuels would therefore generate large compliance surpluses. More immediately, and from January, managing the compliance surplus generated by fuels that fall below the 89.3 level and deficits from those that exceed this number will be a priority. Deficits will be penalised at a cost of €2,400 per tonne of very low sulphur fuel oil equivalent. So the priority will be effective management of the surpluses and deficits. There are several ways in which to make the most of the Fuel EU regulation, and some large companies will inevitably manage this themselves. They will use a system of banking or borrowing surpluses and deficits, or pooling ships within their own fleets to minimise deficits and the €2,400 penalties by offsetting them against surpluses. Smaller owners, on the other hand, may not have scope to manage this process themselves. They are likely to adopt similar strategies, but with the assistance of specialist clearinghouses, consultancies, and intermediaries. Now, let's turn to the emissions trading system, which is set to tighten. Seatrade has previously examined the EU emissions trading system in its regulatory coverage, but 2025 is an important year in this context too. By the end of September, owners with ships trading in, to, or from the European Economic Area will have to surrender allowances for 2024 based on the emissions monitored, reported, and verified following the system entering into force last January. So far, the ETS applies to cargo and passenger ships of 5,000 gross tonnes or more. From the beginning of 2025, it will also apply to offshore ships of more than 5,000 gross tonnes, and offshore and general cargo ships ranging in size from 400 gross tonnes to 5,000 gross tonnes will come under review by the EU in 2026 to determine whether they should be included in the ETS from 2028. The phase-in timeline not only widens the range of ships that will be required to meet ETS rules, it also strengthens the requirements. Allowances equivalent to 40% of total emissions verified in 2024 will have to be surrendered by the end of September 2025, and in September 2026, the allowances will rise to cover 70% of total 2025 emissions, and in September 2027, the requirement will increase to ensure that allowances cover 100% of emissions. Although methane and nitrous oxide emissions are already being monitored since January, only carbon dioxide emissions will be accounted for under the ETS for 2024 and 2025. However, these additional emissions will fall under the scope of ETS from the beginning of 2026. Unlike Fuel EU Maritime, there is no upside in the emissions trading system. It is simply a price that ship owners trading in or with the European Economic Area will have to pay for emissions from their ships. So what about the Mediterranean Emissions Control Area? This regulation could potentially cause headaches for ship owners and operators from 2025. Due to come into force at the beginning of May, the emissions control area will limit the sulphur content in ships' fuel under MARPOL Annex 6 Regulation 14. This will require ships operating in the Mediterranean either all of the time or transiting either way between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans to use bunkers with a maximum sulphur content of 0.1%. Ships with exhaust gas cleaning systems, known as scrubbers, will be excluded from the requirement. However, a note of caution here. The scrubbers must be capable of scrubbing fuel down to a sulfur content of 0.1% or less. Ship owners trading in various regions have become accustomed to emissions control area compliance. Other areas include regions such as the Baltic Sea, the North Sea, North America, and the United States Caribbean Sea. Others are under discussion, as are nitrogen oxide emission control areas. However, the Mediterranean emissions control area is likely to prove a particular challenge for the many vessels trading from Asia to Europe, which will have to switch from heavy fuels to low sulfur grades after passing through the Suez Canal. The Mediterranean emissions control area will have implications for shipping companies' bunkering strategies, as well as tanker movements, according to experts. London shipbroker Gibson recently pointed out that owners without scrubbers capable of scrubbing down to 0.1% sulfur content will face significantly higher fuel costs. The price difference between very low sulfur fuel oil with a sulfur content of 0.5% and marine gas oil with 0.1% is approximately 35%. So far this year, Gibson said, very low sulfur fuel oil has been available across the Mediterranean region at an average price of about $590 per tonne. Ultra low sulfur fuel oil or marine gas oil, complying with the 0.1% sulfur limit, on the other hand, has been selling for an average of around $800 per tonne. Gibson estimates that current Mediterranean bunker demand is about 21.5 million tonnes a year, with very low sulfur fuel oil accounting for slightly less than half of this. However, demand for this fuel is expected to drop sharply from next May. The new regulation clearly has important implications for bunkering ports generally, particularly those in Europe and east of Suez. However, it will require significant changes to fuel supplies at bunker hubs in and around the Mediterranean, including Algeciras, Augusta, Genoa, Gibraltar, Istanbul, Malta, and Piraeus. The new emissions control area will also have an impact on tanker trades, Gibson has predicted, with some very low sulfur fuel oil likely to be exported out of the region, most likely bound for east of Suez. Meanwhile, demand for compliant grades, including marine gas oil and ultra-low sulfur fuel oil, will increase, generating more cargoes from the US and the Middle East. We hope that this podcast has demonstrated the importance of developing robust fuel and bunkering strategies if they are not already in place. Thank you for listening, and best wishes to everyone.